everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to unpack some seriously thought-provoking stuff today?
Always up for a good challenge.
Awesome. Well, today we're taking a look at industrial policy,
Ooh, interesting.
and specifically what we can all learn from the experiences of various Asian economies over the past few decades.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Our main source material today is a chapter called The Role of Industrial Policy, Lessons from Asia, written by an economist named Mushtaq Khan.
Okay.
So get ready for some myth busting, because one of the most surprising things we'll discover is how these Asian economies didn't just stumble into success. They actually kind of engineered it.
You're telling me they created their own competitive advantage?
That's exactly what we're going to explore. It challenges that whole notion that it's all just about natural resources or cheap labor.
Right, the classic assumption.
Exactly. So buckle up, because things are about to get interesting.
Sounds good. Let's
Yeah.
dive in.
Okay. So when we talk about the Asian miracle, we often think of those incredible growth stories. Places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan.
Yeah, those economies that just exploded onto the scene.
Right. But here's the thing that often gets missed. It wasn't just about opening up to global trade and riding that wave.
Interesting. So there was more to it than just free market forces at play.
Much more. They used industrial policy very strategically to nurture specific industries and to actually build that competitive edge.
That's a pretty different story than what we usually hear.
It is. And I bet some of you are thinking, hold on, isn't that like messing with the free market? Isn't that kind of heresy in the world of economics?
Yeah, I can see how that might raise some eyebrows.
Totally. And that's precisely where it gets super fascinating. This chapter argues that comparative advantage...
Which is the idea that some countries are just naturally better at producing certain things, right?
Exactly. Well, it argues that that's not necessarily set in stone.
So it's not just some preordained economic fate.
Nope. It can actually be developed strategically.
Within certain limits, of course.
Of course. But it challenges those traditional assumptions.
So these governments were actively shaping their economic destinies instead of just accepting what they thought they were good at.
Exactly. And that's a stark contrast to the market fundamentalist approach that we saw in other places.
Like in the UK and the US.
Yeah, which ultimately led to deindustrialization in many of those regions.
So if industrial policy is more than just letting the market decide, how would you actually define it?
It's a great question, and I think it's any policy that's intentionally designed to boost technologies and capabilities that lead to higher productivity across society.
Okay, so it's about fostering innovation and efficiency.
Exactly. Now, within that, there are two main types of industrial policy that we need to unpack: horizontal and vertical.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference?
So horizontal policies aim to improve the overall business environment for everyone across the board.
So making it easier to do business in general.
Exactly. Think investing in better infrastructure,
Yeah.
streamlining regulations, promoting education and skills development.
Right, so it's kind of like creating a fertile ground for businesses to thrive regardless of their specific sector.
Exactly. A level playing field.
Got it. What about vertical policies then?
Those are the ones that target specific sectors or technologies.
Okay, so instead of just improving the business environment in general, you're giving a boost to certain industries that you want to see grow.
Precisely. Like, imagine a government that wants to build a world-class biotech industry. They might provide targeted subsidies for biotech startups, invest heavily in R&D, or create special economic zones to attract investment in that sector.
So it's like they're picking winners and losers in a way.
That's a common criticism, and it's something we definitely need to examine. But even seemingly neutral policies can actually disadvantage certain sectors if those sectors have very specific needs that aren't being addressed.
Right, so even if you try to be totally hands-off, you could still be unintentionally hindering some industries more than others.
Exactly. Imagine a one-size-fits-all approach to environmental regulations. It might be totally manageable for some industries, but absolutely cripple others.
That's a great point. So sometimes targeted support is necessary to create a truly level playing field.
Precisely. And it's not always about favoritism. It's about recognizing that some sectors might need extra help to overcome very specific challenges or disadvantages.
So in a way, it's about leveling the playing field in a more nuanced way.
Exactly. Now, here's a key insight from the East Asian experience. Their success wasn't because their bureaucrats had some magical crystal ball and could pick winners in advance.
So it wasn't about seeing the future of the economy.
No, it was about having systems in place that allowed for constant adaptation and adjustment.
So they were willing to change course if something wasn't working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were very quick to drop initiatives that weren't panning out, and they were willing to shift gears as needed.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
So flexibility was key.
Absolutely. But even with the most innovative ideas, you still need the capacity to actually manufacture things right.
Yeah, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't actually produce anything, it's all for nothing.
Exactly. And this is a major hurdle for countries that have gone through deindustrialization.
Because they've lost a lot of those manufacturing capabilities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They've lost the tacit knowledge, the organizational capabilities that were once embedded in all those manufacturing firms.
So it's not just about the physical factories closing down. It's about losing the know-how, the expertise that went along with them.
Right. Think about the UK, for example. As manufacturing declined, they didn't just lose factories, they lost that deep knowledge of how to run a factory efficiently, manage complex supply chains, and all the intricate details of production.
It's like losing a recipe, not just the ingredients.
Mm.
You might have all the parts, but you don't know how to put them together to make a working machine.
That's such a perfect analogy. And these organizational capabilities are like the secret sauce of efficient production, and they're often deeply rooted in a specific workforce, a cultural context, and a history of learning by doing. It's not something you can just download or replicate overnight.
So how do you rebuild those capabilities once they're lost? Is it as simple as throwing money at the problem and offering subsidies to lure companies back?
If only it were that easy. Unfortunately, there are all sorts of things that can get in the way, things economists call contracting failures.
Contracting failures. That sounds a bit technical. Can you give me an example that would make sense even to someone who's not an economist?
Okay, so imagine you're a company trying to revive a very specific type of manufacturing. You need to train workers in some highly specialized skill, right?
Right.
But there's a risk that once you've invested all that time and money in training, your competitors who didn't bother with training might just poach your newly skilled workers.
Oh, I see. So the company that invests in training ends up kind of subsidizing its competitors.
Exactly. And that creates a huge disincentive to invest in training in the first place. And that's just one example. There are all sorts of these contracting failures that can hinder the development of those crucial organizational capabilities.
So simply providing subsidies without addressing those underlying issues might not be enough. It might even backfire.
Absolutely. So it's not just about throwing money at a problem. It's about understanding those specific roadblocks and then crafting policies that target them directly.
It makes you wonder how you even begin to design an effective industrial policy. Where do you even start?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and that's precisely what we're going to dig into next time.
I can't wait.
Stay tuned. Yeah, it really does feel like we're putting together a puzzle, doesn't it?
It does.
We've got the what and the why of industrial policy, but the how, that seems to be where it gets really interesting.
Definitely no instruction manual for this one.
Right. Well, our source material actually highlights this really cool concept called learning rents.
Learning rents.
Yeah, it's basically like giving companies this temporary financial cushion, a little breathing room to experiment, to learn, and even to make mistakes without that immediate pressure of turning a profit.
So you're not just throwing them into the deep end and saying sink or swim.
Exactly. You're giving them a chance to really build up those capabilities that we were talking about, even if it means taking some risks along the way.
Now that makes sense.
Yeah.
But wouldn't just handing out subsidies up front create some problem, kind of perverse incentives for companies to focus more on getting those subsidies than on actually becoming competitive?
That's a great point. It's not just about giving them free money and hoping for the best.
Right.
The real art is in structuring these learning rents in a way that encourages genuine effort and prevents complacency. It makes me think of those science experiments where you have to change one variable at a time to see what happens.
Oh, yeah.
If you change too many things at once, you don't know what's actually causing the result.
It's like trying to bake a cake and throwing in all the ingredients at once.
Exactly. You'll end up with a mess.
Exactly. And speaking of getting things right, this brings us to a really fascinating case study. The Indian automobile industry in the 1980s.
Oh, okay. Tell me more.
So picture this. India partners with Suzuki, and they give Suzuki access to the protected Indian market. That's the learning rent.
Okay.
But here's the catch. Suzuki had to meet these really strict quality standards, and they also had to achieve a high level of local content, meaning they had to invest heavily in developing the capabilities of their Indian suppliers.
So it wasn't just about bringing in a foreign company to build cars in India. It was about creating a whole ecosystem of skilled manufacturers within India.
Exactly. It was about transferring knowledge and expertise, not just jobs.
Then did it work?
It did. The Indian auto industry, which was once this protected infant industry, actually blossomed into a global competitor.
Wow, that's a really inspiring example. But I imagine it wasn't just about setting the right targets. It must have taken a lot of effort to actually monitor progress and make sure that everyone was following through on their commitments.
Absolutely. The success of industrial policy really hinges on the ability to enforce the conditions attached to any kind of subsidies or incentives and to hold everyone accountable.
Right, because without accountability, people might just take the money and run.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more interesting. Because it's not just about having well-designed policies on paper. It's about understanding the political and social context in which those policies are implemented.
So the same policy that might work wonders in one country could completely fail in another.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And this is where the idea of political settlements comes in.
Okay, so remind me what a political settlement is again.
It's basically about understanding who holds power in a society and how that power is distributed.
Okay. So in some countries, the government might have the authority to strictly enforce those conditions and to withdraw support from companies that aren't delivering. But in other countries, it might be much more challenging to do that.
Exactly. Think about those East Asian economies that we discussed earlier.
Ah.
Their more centralized power structures gave their governments the leverage to really enforce those conditions and hold companies accountable.
Because they could credibly say, we're giving you these benefits, but if you don't deliver, we're pulling the plug.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because they could actually do that, companies knew they had to take it seriously. But in other contexts, like in some South Asian countries, that kind of tough love might not be feasible.
So the distribution of power can make it really difficult to withdraw support from those underperforming firms, even when it's clear that those policies aren't working.
Absolutely. And this can lead to a situation where infant industries never quite grow up.
Because they're always being coddled and protected.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
Mm.
But even in contexts where that kind of strict enforcement is challenging, there are still some really valuable lessons to be learned from those experiences.
Like what?
Or remember those ex-post rents we talked about?
Rewarding success after it's been achieved.
Exactly. Well, that approach turned out to be surprisingly effective in situations where enforcing the conditions on those upfront subsidies was nearly impossible.
Oh yeah, the Suzuki case was a great example of that. They structured that agreement in a way that Suzuki only really reaped the rewards after they hit those ambitious targets.
Precisely. And it highlights a really crucial point about designing effective industrial policy. Sometimes the best approach is to think carefully about who is actually in the best position to enforce those conditions, rather than assuming it always has to be the government.
So in the Suzuki case, it was actually Suzuki itself, driven by its own self-interest, that ensured those conditions were met.
Exactly. It's like using the existing power dynamics to your advantage, rather than trying to fight against them.
It's kind of like judo, using your opponent's strength against them.
That's a great analogy. And while the specific policies used in India might not be applicable everywhere, the underlying principles are incredibly valuable.
So it's about understanding the incentives, the power structures, and finding these creative ways to align them with your goals.
Exactly. It's about being strategic and adaptable.
So it sounds like industrial policy isn't this simple formula of pick winners and hand out subsidies. It's a much more nuanced and strategic process than that.
Absolutely. It requires a lot of careful analysis, a deep understanding of the context, and a willingness to adapt and learn along the way.
There are going to be mistakes and setbacks for sure.
Definitely.
But it seems like the Asian experience, with all its successes and challenges, offers a wealth of knowledge for anyone who's trying to figure out how to use industrial policy as a tool for development in the 21st century.
I think so too. It's a rich tapestry of experiences to learn from.
It sounds like we need to move away from these simplistic debates about government intervention versus free markets.
Right. It's not that black and white.
And embrace a much more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of how industrial policy can be used to shape economic outcomes.
I couldn't agree more. It's about finding the right balance and the right approach for each specific situation.
This has been so insightful. I feel like I've gained a whole new toolkit for thinking about economic development and the role of government.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the Asian experience with all its triumphs and stumbles is a treasure trove of knowledge. There's so much we can learn from their successes, their missteps, and their constant adaptation to changing circumstances.
So no easy answers, but a whole lot of inspiration to think bigger, bolder, and more strategically about how we shape our economic future. What a fantastic deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking at things a little differently after all this, too. It seems like industrial policy, when it's done right, thoughtfully and strategically, can be a really powerful tool for growth.
It's not about some heavy-handed top-down approach.
Yeah.
It's not about picking winners and losers or dictating every move.
Right.
It's about understanding how markets actually work,
Yeah.
recognizing that governments do have a role in shaping those markets,
Yeah.
and then finding creative ways to encourage the kind of innovation and competitiveness that benefits everyone.
It's about creating the right conditions for success.
Exactly. So what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners are walking away with today?
Ooh, good question.
Mhm.
What about you?
I'd say don't underestimate the power of well-crafted industrial policy. It can be a real game changer, especially for countries that are trying to, climb the economic ladder or revitalize industries that have been struggling.
Right, not just accepting the status quo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it does require a certain level of sophistication, a nuanced understanding of how markets work, what can go wrong.
And how to tailor the solutions to specific situations.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah, it seems like that tailoring is so crucial. It's not about just copying what worked somewhere else. It's about analyzing your own situation, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and yeah, those power dynamics that we were talking about.
They're so important.
And then coming up with a strategy that really fits.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think of it like building a house. You wouldn't use the exact same blueprint regardless of the location, the climate, the soil conditions, right?
You have to adapt it.
We'd adapt the design to fit the context.
Right, make sure it's actually going to stand up.
Exactly. The same principle applies to industrial policy.
This has been so eye-opening, honestly. I feel like I've learned a whole new way to think about economic development and the role that government can play.
It's about expanding our toolkit.
Yeah, and challenging those old assumptions.
Absolutely. And remember, the Asian experience with all its ups and downs, it's a goldmine of information.
Oh, it's fascinating.
There's so much we can learn from their successes, their failures, and how they constantly adapted to new challenges.
So no easy answers,
But
but a whole lot of inspiration to think bigger, bolder, and more strategically about how we can actually shape our economic future. What a fantastic deep dive.
it really has been.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you.
Likewise. And for everyone listening out there, here's a little something to ponder. Given everything we've unpacked today, what kind of industrial policy approach do you think would be most effective for your own country, for your industry, or your field? What are those unique challenges and opportunities that you see? And how could you use these insights to make a real difference? Keep those brain wheels turning, and until next time, happy deep diving.